been in the making for a while. So it's actually based on sort of many years of observation and research. And it's been really just a very fun journey in the direction of this book. So I'm very excited to share it with you. So today I'm going to draw upon this book to tell you some stories of some college students. And I think mostly we have college students here. So if any of these stories kind of move you to say, well, that's kind of my experience, or that's not really my experience, and I'd love to hear from you as well. And I'm hoping to try to make enough time for Q&A. So how much time would you like me to, when do you want me to shut up, basically? Half an hour? Okay, good. That sounds good. Half an hour is when we start to see the eyes glaze over anyway, so that's good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to rely upon what we call raw data in research. And I'm going to rely upon the words of my research respondents, the people who were involved in my research. I'm going to use their voices to bring out some of the issues related to Muslim undergraduate identity. And campus culture, diversity, pluralism, and American identity. So all of these things are kind of mixed up. So I'm going to try to tease out and unpack some of those things. So the book is based on ethnographic research that I conducted at, very familiar to you, I'm sure, Georgetown and George Washington universities. Most of the research was done in 2002 and 2003. A little bit in 2004 as well, but also later in 2009 and 2010 I came back to do some follow-up research. Does anybody know what ethnographic research is? Yeah? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm doing something similar.
You're doing ethnographic research. You poor thing, right?
So pretty much you tell like it is, it's really kind of getting perspective from those who you are researching.
Absolutely. So what you're really trying to, and people like to say, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sense of a culture. So what you're trying to do is get as close as possible to a culture and to try to get the meanings that people make within that culture, as opposed to saying, here's what I think about this culture. So you're trying to get as close as possible to. So, but how do you get that? What kind of methods do you use? What do you do in order to get those cultural meanings? Can it, yeah?
So observing.
Good.
Interviews.
Perfect.
Surveying.
Yeah? Surveys sometimes, but ethnographic research is really, I like to use this metaphor that you're like, I'm a researcher, I'm like a cookie, and I dunk myself into the milk of this culture. So basically, I immerse myself into this culture as much as possible. And so, of course, you know what happens to the cookie, right? Half of it falls into the milk. And then the milk sort of seeps into the cookie. So you become sort of insider, kind of a mixture of where you try to become what's called a marginal insider. And so that's what I did. I hung out with Muslim undergraduates here at these two campuses, and as you know, it was 2002, so it was not long after 9/11. Now I see a lot of young faces here, so I kind of, I'm not sure if you know what that time was like. I'm sure you have some sense of it, but it was a very tense time, and particularly here in the DC area. Because it was on high security alert, and a lot of Muslim American families were feeling very anxious and were feeling very under surveillance and were feeling very watched. I lived in Alexandria, and so we took the metro all the time, and the feeling in the DC area was just very different from what it was before. So who were I forgot about my PowerPoint. Here's the book, of course. And the fieldwork, as I said, was ethnographic. And I hung out, as I said, on these college campuses with these Muslim student communities. But I particularly chose 26 young women, 13 from each campus. And I interviewed them intensively at least once per month over a year. So it's kind of, I tried to get a kind of a very in-depth picture. All of these young women identified as Muslim in a variety of different ways. as you may know, anybody who belongs, who identifies or is affiliated with a particular religious faith, there are many, many different types of religiosity, not just levels of religiosity, but also types of religiosity. And also, I selected a sample that was ethnically and racially quite diverse. So these are some of the types in there. Now, I don't want you to get distracted by those words yet. But what I was interested in was Muslim American women's identities on campus, but not just that, but how campus culture and the campus environment facilitated or inhibited their identity work to be who they were. Right, to become these Muslim American women, undergraduate student, various other things, right? So how did the campus climate interact with their various identities? One of my favorite research respondents, I'm going to call her Intisar. And as you know, in research, we try to use confidentiality and anonymity. So I don't use any of the names of the people that I interviewed. And I chose pseudonyms for them. So Intisar was Somali American, and she arrived in the U.S. As a refugee in elementary school, during elementary school time. And after she arrived, she felt like she just didn't fit in. She felt very much like an outsider on multiple levels. One as a Somali, one as an African, then as a refugee, and all of these different things. And as a Muslim, of course, on top of that. So all these things, she felt like she just didn't belong. And so when she joined school, she started to play basketball. She just kind of gravitated in that direction. And she was good. She was very good at basketball. And so this gave her access to a cool athletic community, mostly African American. And then she felt like she sort of belonged to a part of. It was so basketball was what I call an indigenizing factor for her. It made her feel and be more American. If any of you have ever have an inclination towards literature, you might want to read a book called The Chosen by Chaim Potok. He's a Jewish American writer. It's a it's a fantastic novel, long, kind of hard to get through, but it also looks at Jewish American identities, recent immigrants from Eastern Europe and so on, and how baseball in that context was used as an indigenizing. So all the boys from the yeshivas get together and play baseball because they want to show how American they are. Now, a lot of time has passed since then, and so here you find basketball now serving as kind of that indigenizing factor. So I'm going to look at Intisar's words, and let's look at her own words. She said, "You became like everyone else. You didn't have to be like a refugee. I could become part of this whole new community. I didn't feel like I had to say who I was, where I came from. Basketball defined me. It made everything easy. It made you feel like everyone else. I wasn't some Somali outcast." And here you see sort of race and class and global sort of factors kind of coming together to make her into some Somali outcast. And it's very powerful and very painful. "I could just play basketball and be Intisar, who plays basketball and who also happened to be Somali and Muslim, when those things would at first define me." Now, Intisar was very religious, so she loved being Muslim, and she also loved being Somali. So it's not like she's trying to just, shove it all away, and she's not proud of it, and she doesn't like being, and she wants to be white American. No, none of that. She just is tired of being like a bug on the wall, being examined as this Somali Muslim person all the time. And they just define her. So basketball made it easy by displacing some of these factors in their very close and intimate focus on her. So playing basketball allowed her to cover up, to some degree, her difference. This doesn't mean that people forget that she's Somali and Muslim, but it allows her to cover them and play them down a little. Now, a lot of what my book talks about is about people trying to play down and play up identities. It doesn't change that they are Muslim or whatever racial or ethnic group, but they try to play up and play down in various situations. And I know you've all experienced this. So when I attend a conference, there are certain identities that I try to play down. So I'm a mom. I don't try to play that up at an academic conference. I'm not trying to be super mom at an academic conference. On the other hand, when I'm hanging out with my family, I'm not trying to play up this stuff. Because most of my family are not really academic types, so they're going to feel distant from me if I do all that stuff. So we play up and play down various identities. Now, what happened when Intisar turned 15 is that her mother, who was quite traditional and came from a fairly rural Somali background, she said, "You're done with all this basketball and this sports stuff. You need to stop this, or you need to start wearing hijab when you're playing basketball." Intisar, at that age, she wasn't really into the whole hijab thing, but she complied. She said, "Okay, I'm going to do it." She was a little resentful of it. So then she said, "Okay, well, let's do a compromise. I'm going to continue to play basketball, and I'm going to play basketball while wearing hijab." So here she says, "Suddenly, my mom comes out of nowhere. You can't just be Intisar, the normal person who plays basketball. You have to carry yourself in traditional cultural way, which includes wearing hijab. I got away with it for a year, playing basketball with hijab. It's really difficult to wear hijab." Now, Intisar at this point, when I interviewed her, wore hijab and loved it. But she's sort of examining the process of it. People assume certain traits that should go with hijab. And the hardest thing for me to do was to go along with stereotypes. So it's the burden of the stereotypes rather than the hijab itself that she is wrestling with. Like hijab in basketball. I thought it was a natural thing. She didn't see a conflict between the hijab and the basketball. It was seamless. So I play basketball, so I wear hijab. Those are just some of the things I do. My non-Muslim friends are like, "Can you do this? How can you play basketball? Is this allowed?" So those qualities that go with being an athlete, with being a sportswoman, being mobile, being flexible, being a little bit aggressive, all those things. Can you do those things once you put that thing on? Doesn't that kind of make you into an immobile little woman who only has to study and cook, I suppose? Right? So she struggled with that. And you can say, yeah, I can fight those stereotypes, but fighting stereotypes is hard work. And that's what she found, that the constant examination, interrogation, the constant surveillance of these expectations became a burden. So on the other hand, she had her mother saying, "What's this running around? You're a big girl. You can't be running around and showing your body and playing basketball, being in sports when you are a young woman." And on the other hand, the non-Muslims who say, "You're not supposed to be like us in this area. You're supposed to be different. There's supposed to be a binary." So where she was, so her non-Muslim friends and her a traditional mother, both of them, in different ways, obliged her to go and sort of conform to that stereotypical Muslim woman image and to conform to stereotypes about what she could or could not do as a hijabi, where initially, as a young woman, she had found a space of comfort and belonging through basketball. Now she couldn't do that anymore. So she stopped playing basketball. I'm gonna go back to that for a moment. She stopped playing basketball because she said, "This is too much. I don't know. I can't. This is too much work." But then she went to college, and she said she took an elective, because you can take all kinds of electives, right? She took an elective in basketball. Right? We all know about electives, right? So she took an elective that allowed her to play basketball. She joined this class, and everybody looked at her and like, "African hijabi woman, we're not choosing you on our team." And then they saw her play, and they were like, "Huh? What just happened here?" Right? "Who exactly are you?" And that's, in a sense, it was exhilarating, right? It was energizing. It was exciting to be, taking people by surprise. But it's exhausting. She said, "I just got really tired of this teaching role." And then she talks about this. She said, "At college, at first, they wouldn't pick me on my team, but then, not to brag, but I was good. Some Muslims thought it was cute that I was hijabi and played basketball." So some Muslim women thought, oh, that's really cool that you're a hijabi and you're basketball, that's so cool. And some of them gossiped about it. Some of them said, oh, astaghfirullah, you know. I'm sure you've heard that in various aspects. They said, this is so bad, she's playing this contact sport, right? It's not just a sport, it's a contact sport. And she's playing with boys, right? So she came under surveillance for that. And on the other hand, she had these people, you're so cool, you're like a role model. And on the other hand, she had the non-Muslims going, what? You're playing basketball? And you're so good at this? What is this? So she said, I kept my basketball thing undercover from both Muslims and non-Muslims. I got tired of this teaching role. I just wanted to be myself. If there's one line in my respondents' interview data that sums up my book, it's that. I just wanted to be myself. And then she said, at first it had solved problems for me when I arrived in the US, and now it just became a problem itself. So she sort of, what I found was that she sort of wilted under the scrutiny and what she called the amazement of both Muslims and non-Muslims, and got increasingly weary of shattering this mold set for Muslim women by both groups. And at the same time, she started to question herself, am I absolutely sure this is a good thing that I'm doing? Should I be playing basketball and becoming this, this role model for playing basketball? Right now, Muslims under scrutiny, under surveillance in the DC area particularly. Then there's the war on terror, right? That was at its height at that time. And am I serving as a bad example in my community? So the intensity of the surveillance on and by Muslims, especially of Muslim female bodies, because it's female bodies that in every community are under surveillance, right? And if you've noticed, this is something that I look at also in another paper, where like the recent first the Miley Cyrus thing, then something else. Oh yeah, the Kim Kardashian break the internet thing, right? It's always a woman's body that breaks the internet, right? And it's always the woman's body that is under surveillance and that bears the burden of representation for a community. Right? So Intisar got sick and tired of this. Now, when people hear Intisar's story, I'm gonna check to see. Okay, when people hear Intisar's story, when Americans hear Intisar's story, they're like, "Oh, poor Intisar! Screw your mom, right? Get rid of all that. Why do you bother with all this stuff? Go play your basketball." Intisar wanted her mom. She wanted her Islam. She wanted her hijab, and she wanted her basketball. But she's forced into this corner where she has to kind of choose which one. And so she had to make that choice. And she dumped the basketball, right? Now, other people might make different choices. They might choose to have, to force a different trajectory. But for Intisar, she chose not to play basketball anymore. She missed it. When I spoke to her, she missed it, and she continued to, but when she was by herself, she was shoot hoops all by herself, but she didn't play basketball anymore. And so Intisar's experience demonstrates for me that even though when you come to a U.S. campus, an American campus, you find that identity options are many, right? There are many identity options. You're like, oh, you can be anything you want when you go to college, right? And people talk about college as that identity exploration. Find out who you are, right? You can be anything you want. Find out who you are. And if you watch any movie about college, it's also about the same story, right? Find out who you are. I'm not going to be that nerd anymore. I'm going to be, I don't know what, right? Despite this multiplicity of options on U.S. campuses in terms of identity, and people do identify with diverse, multiple, changing identity backgrounds, these options are not freely available to everyone. Not everybody can choose freely. And if you if you do choose options, they are not chosen lightly. They have consequences, right? They come with certain burdens. And for minoritized people in a racist social order, they're not really choices at all either. There are often choices that are imposed upon you. So people like Intisar are obviously not the only people who try to fit in. They're not the only people who fail to fit in. They're not the only people who have to make compromises and to give up certain things in order to fit in. But we can use the example of Muslim American women like Intisar to show what happens when people engage with a liberal, multicultural, diverse college campus, and then see what happens to them, right? So my context, I'm gonna make sure I'm doing okay. My context is, of course, college, is college where the as the higher education scholars say, the single most potent source of influence on college students is your peers. Right? Now, we scholars and academics and professors like to believe that that is not true, that it's our classes and the textbooks and the books that are the most powerful influence and life-changing factors for you guys. But it seems that that is not the case, that your peers are the people who exercise the most influence upon you. Well, what happens, and this is what I look at, what happens when Muslim American students, many of whom are second-generation immigrants, and many of whom, but not all, many of whom grow up within religiously observant families, to varying degrees and in various ways, of course, and many of whom, but not all, embrace religious lifestyles as well. And many of whom, but not all, who have strong religious identities. Because in my research also, I think I probably started out when I was a researcher thinking, Muslims are all just a particular way, and that's what I'm going to find. And I found not true, right? And I'm at Georgetown, and I'm meeting people who didn't even know that there was a Muslim Student Association, for example. And people completely culturally assimilated, and at the same time identified fully as Muslim. So I realized that the range was much more extensive than I had initially thought. Now, college, this book is not just about Muslims, it's also about college. So people who come to my talks like this, they'll, like I was at Purdue and somebody came up to me and she said, well, I'm Christian and I feel like this is like my life. And I said, exactly. I use Muslim women as a model to show what happens when peer pressure exercises its influence upon you and forces you in a particular direction. So I met, for example, religiously observant Christian students or others who felt the same alienation towards youth culture and hedonism, the hedonism that becomes normative on college campuses, and felt the same way about the pressures upon them. So if you look at my chapters, here we go. So the three middle chapters in my book are about alcohol culture, sartorial culture, which is just a big name for clothes, and gendered and sexual behavior. So people say, what? That is so stereotypical. That is so Orientalist. Why would you pick these three things, and talk about Muslim women? Well, guess why? Because all the interviews, these were the three big things that my research respondents talked about. Not because they were all drinking and sleeping around, no. Not only that, some were, yes, but most of them felt that these were shaping factors for their identities, even if they weren't involved in alcohol culture, even if they weren't involved in sort of the hookup culture. The funny thing is that, I'm going to go to... So I'm going to go to another research respondent. She was white. Heather was white, and she was a senior. She had converted to Islam sometime after high school in the Midwest, and she was active in the Muslim student group. She didn't drink. She various other factors she didn't do. She passed many of the main tests that we would set as criteria for being religious. Now, she had friends who didn't really know that she was Muslim. So sometimes they would talk about Muslims in a way that was kind of awkward for her, and they didn't realize that she was Muslim as well. So she said, my non-Muslim friends say, why don't Muslims date? Their parents are insane. They need to let them be normal and let them date. They came to America. They just need to accept the fact that their kids are American. Now, I want you to look very closely at what's going on in this quote. So here you find a conflation of certain tropes. So you have being weird, right? Why are they so weird? Let them be normal, right? Let them be normal and don't be weird. And at the same time, dating and being normal, dating and being American as well. So all these things are kind of bunched up together, that you have to be dating and you have to be in order to be normal as well as to be American. So you have these bunching up of things. So you're weird when you're Muslim and foreign. Of course, you're looking at these parents who are, many of them are naturalized citizens. So when these people look at them, they look at them not as Americans, but still as foreigners. Right? I'm a naturalized citizen myself, and I know that very often when people talk about Americans, they don't include naturalized citizens. They're not really Americans. They're kind of Americans, but not really, right? So they find that these tropes are bunched up together. Now, in 1992, when I started my research, I was using this book because it's a book about higher education and gender, like women in higher education, and it's called Educated in Romance. Right? So a lot of women go to college and the focus is very much on romance. Now, a few years ahead, 2008, this is the book about sex on college campuses. It's not about romance anymore, right? And my research respondents knew this. They were very aware of this. And they knew also the ways in which they fit and did not fit into this college culture. So, so in this way, as well as in others, in terms of also in alcohol culture, I find that peer youth leisure culture on college campuses is a powerful medium that constructs marginality for other ways of being, such as Muslim religious ways of being as well. And many of my research respondents felt that many of their peers associated Muslims with the usual Orientalist stereotypes that Edward Said has talked about, as well as, again going back to those bunching of tropes, being the opposite of what a normal American, a normal undergraduate, a normal kid was. So they saw these things as these stereotypes as stereotypes that they were constantly fighting, resisting, correcting, but also sometimes using in their identity work. And that's something that I didn't really expect to find. So I'm going to go over just two quotes because I'm sorry I don't have time to talk about Jon Stewart. So here, for example, you have Myra, who was a Pakistani American freshman, and she knew that it just wasn't cool to be sexually inactive by choice. Right? So she said, when I talk to my friends at college about boyfriends, and they're all talking about their boyfriends, and I don't say, oh, I didn't ever want a boyfriend, or like a boyfriend for me is never a real boyfriend. So she doesn't go into real detail about, oh, we're Muslim and we do platonic and blah, blah, blah. She doesn't want to go into all those details. She said, I'm not going to explain all these details to people. I'll just be like, yep, never had one. Right? So what does that imply? Never had one. That she could if she wished, right? It implies, but it's not what she means. It's not what she means, but she just says never had one to leave it kind of open. So what does that imply, right? It's a mainstream American story. I've never had a boyfriend, right? So that's cool, because it's an accepted type. It's an accepted mainstream type. But to say not, never, will not do it with him if I have it. Just all these things are not cool. And she knows this, so she plays it down. So this is what Myra does. She plays down her religiosity in matters of gendered and sexual behavior. And many of my research respondents did this. And there's a sociologist called Irving Goffman. If you have a chance, you might want to read. He has some really wonderful books. One is called Stigma. And he talks about how people who have stigmatized identities, like certain religious identities or certain racial identities, certain sexual identities, can be stigmatized in society. So what people do very often is they try to play them down. Now, you have, for example, right? right? You know who that is, right? Justin Bieber. And what kind of glasses is he wearing? His glasses are like mine, almost, right? Why? Because he's selling a book. He wrote an autobiography. So now Justin Bieber wears the big glasses. Here am I. I'm selling a book. I'm a nerd. So you play up and play down certain identities. FDR, we know that he was in a wheelchair, but we have very few photographs of him in a wheelchair. And usually when he came in for meetings, it said that he was already at the table. So he didn't come in his wheelchair. So we play up and we play down particular identities. Now, on the other hand, you have, I'm going to... let's see. Okay, so on the other hand, I had another research respondent. Her name was Amber, and she wore hijab. Okay, now she was an officer in the Muslim Student Association, and here's what she said. She said, I feel if you're a wishy-washy type of Muslim, you'll just be walked over. I feel like I have to be even more loud about my identity. In class, when they're talking about Muslims or Islam, heads turn towards you. You're expected to... Does it sound familiar? Yeah, heads turn towards you. If you're expected to speak. If you don't, then you're completely selling out. Why aren't you serving as a representative? Right? So there were times after 9/11 when I wished I wasn't wearing hijab. You have a responsibility to articulate it, not just what Islam is, but about Muslims here, and of course about everything else related to anything that is, anywhere near about Muslims and Islam. You should be knowledgeable. You should be articulate enough to talk about it. So the burden of representation is just too much. But she steps up to the plate, right? So she's constantly representing, and she's exhausted. She's just exhausted with all that burden of representation. Now, then you had, because you have a certain expectation of who Muslims are, and then they're supposed to be that way. And if they're not that way, then people are a little confused. Who are these Muslims who are acting in this very, playing basketball or, I don't know, wearing hijab and smoking or something? So, oh my God, this is really weird. What's going on here? So you had Intisar, going back also to Intisar, who said she got really tired of and it may sound familiar to some of you, of this dynamic in the Muslim student group where people who had really close friends, like who were the opposite sex, would in public act like sister, just very very careful, very conservative. Yeah, that sounds familiar, right? Okay, good. So that's how they would act. They would act like they had never seen a woman before, right? Or they would act like they had never seen a man before. And in their apartment parties, they're all like, yay, let's have fun. So why were they doing this? This is very strange. So Intisar talked about this, and she got sick of this. She was like, I wish they would just let their hair down and act normal, because then we can go out, we can just, I'm not saying let's go dating or anything, but let's just be normal. But she said, I can't do that, because then I'd be on the outside. I'd be seen as the liberal one. So she says, when you get to this college age, here we are, a lovely MSA. We're a little different than, say, as in Americans, sort of the stereotyping of Americans who are partying, right? So all the Americans are out there partying, and here we are, and we're the good people. So I suppose most of the time, and I'm being ironic here, of course, so I suppose most of the time we're afraid that our faith is going to get lost in the midst of acting too college-like, too normal. So we'd rather be conservative. So what are they doing? They're going a little bit to the extreme to be safe, right? In order to stem the flood of assimilation, I'm just going to draw these extra thick boundaries around me and act like I've never seen a boy before, because if I go a little bit to that side, then I might as she said, our faith is going to get lost. So it's very interesting that on the one hand you had people like Myra who were playing down religiosity, and on the other hand you had people like Intisar and Amber who were playing up religiosity that they didn't really necessarily practice all the time. They were playing up these and performing these kind of high-level conservative religious identities. So I'm going to stop there because I want some time to hear from you guys. And yeah, I hope that brought out some of the themes from the book for you.